The British royal family is the Scottish royal family. Scotland has not had a monarchy in quite a few years. We'll get into that when we look at some history. Last year, Britain, we lost the Queen of Britain. So Queen Elizabeth II died after a very long life and a very long reign, the longest reigning British monarch. She actually, part of her funeral was in Scotland. The Scottish royal family is very connected to Scotland. The former queen loved Scotland and would spend her entire summers in Scotland at Balmoral Castle. Prince Charles, who is now King Charles III, is also known when he's in Scotland to wear a kilt the entire time to show his love of Scotland. Scotland no longer has its monarch, but it accepts the British as its monarch. There are various movies like Rob Roy and other TV shows like Outlander that tend to showcase these tumultuous history moments that the Scots and the Brits have had. They have been connected together for a long time. They share the same island connection, so their histories are intertwined, and those histories can be very positive, and they've had tumultuous moments in history as well. Let's take a moment and just look at the history of Scotland. Yeah, so if we go back to the Roman Empire in the 1st century, there was a province of Britannia that was created and talked about. And there are certain places on on that island where it narrowed and there were walls put up so that could control the people from the north and the south, and some of that we've even seen in movies like Game of Thrones, where there's been the wall. So those go back to some ancient ideas of that. So north of the Antonine Wall was Caledonia, and it was inhabited by a group of people called the Picti, who would uprise and force the Roman legions back south, even past the place that was Hadrian's Wall. And Rome finally withdrew from this whole Britain, and the various Gallic raiders were called the Scoti. So there you can see the very beginning of a group of people called Scottish, the Scoti, and they were colonizing Western Scotland and Wales. Before Roman times, and ancient, all the way back, there have been inhabitants on this part of the world. Now, the whole Gallic kingdom, in Gallic, there's even a Gallic language that still exists, and even Gallic songs that still, Gaelic songs that still exist throughout all of Scotland and Wales and Ireland. So you see these influences and these Celtic influences that still exist today. And even the pagan influences with all of that. There were points in history where Christianity moved onto that part of the world and became in favor, although there were still Celtic and pagan traditions that sort of would battle each other for prominence throughout history. Towards the end of the 8th century, Vikings started to really try to inhabit parts of that, the Kingdom of Scotland. And that was the time that the Gaels and the Picts really got together and created the Kingdom of Scotland. And it was a way of uniting a kingdom against these outside forces. Then the last king, Malcolm II, from the 11th century, the kingdom was passed through the daughter's son to the House of Dunkirk or Canmore, and we had the last Dun-held king, Alexander III, who died in 1287. And he left only his infant granddaughter, Margaret, Maid of Norway, as his heir, who died herself kind of 4 years later. So because of these things, England under Edward I took advantage of this time where there weren't real Scottish monarchs, and tried a succession and a series of conquests to take over Scotland and make it become part of England. So that is when we had all of the wars of Scottish independence. And by 1314, you had great tales and great historic moments like Robert the Bruce achieving dazzling victories of the Scots for their independence. Yeah. By 1929, the Scottish independence was ratified by actually papal decree. But we still had about 300 more years of battling with England over Scotland and for it to become a single country. Scotland has remained and kept its independence. Then it sort of got passed back and forth, Scottish independence, through the House of Balliol and the House of Bruce. Scotland's ultimate victory confirmed Scotland as an independent and a sovereign kingdom. So when King David II died in 1371, his nephew Robert II established the House of Stuart. Yeah, Stuart is a very powerful clan in Scotland. Yeah, it has a red tartan, and so it is an ancient monarchy clan. James VI became the Stuart King of Scotland, and also he inherited the throne of England. So we had a time from 1603 when Stuart kings and queens both ruled Scotland and England. By 1707, the two kingdoms were merged together under the Kingdom of Great Britain. That's when we get that term, Great Britain. And this rule until 1914, Queen Anne ended up being the last of the Stuart monarchs. Now, since 1714 with Queen Anne. So since 1714, all of the British monarchs have been British, and we've had the houses of Hanover and Saxe-Coburg, and finally the Gothas, which became the Windsors. And we all know right now the House of Windsor is the British monarchy. Yeah. So this is due all to those descents from James IV and the House of Stuart. Now, during Scottish Enlightenment, well, let me jump back one moment. In 1745, we had Bonnie Prince Charlie, who sailed from France to Scotland, and he tried to regain the British throne. This did not really work. But it was another moment when we tried to have another Scottish independence. And that's been a theme the entire time. During the Scottish Enlightenment and the Revolution, much Scotland became a center of the world, particularly because of things like the steam engine and because there was so much coal that could be mined in places like Britain and places like Scotland. World War I claimed 74,000 Scottish soldiers and an equal amount of civilians. So this was one of the hardest wars on the country. And also we should note that in 1901 to 1961, in those 60 years, about 1.4 million Scottish people immigrated to other countries of the world, including the US. And they were seeking, like many immigrants, better lives in another part of the world. So later, with a kind of industrial decline, and because with the Second World War, and in recent decades, there was a bit of an industrial decline. Then the Second World War happened, and then actually Scotland's done pretty well, and largely because of lots of oil and gas in the north part of the sea. So it is a country with strong resources. From the 50s, nationalism has happened in Scotland, and there's been always this serious debate about Scottish independence from England. So in 1999, this was the first year we went to Edinburgh, Scotland established its own parliament again, and this was after 292 years of absence of having its own parliament. Other moment of history that's important, in 2014, Scotland had a referendum on the ballot to leave England. And so rather than a war, this time it was going to be by a vote. And the vote came pretty close, but the vote did not happen. But since that time, the Scottish National Party, the SNP, has gained many seats and has a kind of power in Scotland. So even interesting of note, in more recent history, is Scotland voted against Brexit, against leaving the European Union, whereas the UK, England voted for leaving, and Brexit passed. So the Scots tend to not be happy, and actually right now most Brits seem not to be happy with Brexit because it's rather hurt their economy. So we don't know in the future where the connection between these two intimately connected countries will be, but it's good to know when you travel how much of an influence Britain has and England has on Scotland, and also what kind of things where their independence lies separate. So that's a bit about Scottish history.